Okay, thanks everybody. We were able to make it in here in within 10 minutes. So I appreciate your patience. My name is Mark Pitch. I'm the president of the Madison Chapter of the Society of Professional Journalists. And one of the things that we like to do is hold events like this for the public in an effort to help explain what we do as journalists. And we're really excited to have this stellar panel before us to talk about the news coverage of Governor Scott Walker, both as a governor and as a potential presidential candidate. It's also thrilling to see so many people here interested in what these folks have to say. So without further ado, I'll introduce them. They'll provide short introductory statements. And then we'll open it up for questions. I might ask the first one or two questions, and then we'll turn it over to you in the audience. Okay. On my far left is Michael Wagner. His Twitter handle is @ProWag, P-R-O-W-A-G. He's an associate professor and the Lewis Meyer Faculty Fellow in the School of Journalism and Mass Communication here at UW-Madison, where he directs the Physiology and Communications Effects Lab. He's also affiliated with the Department of Political Science. He earned his PhD from Indiana University in 2006. He's worked as a political reporter and news anchor at 1470 WMBD CBS 31 in Peoria and 1110 KFAB in Omaha. He studies how different elements of the information environment interact with social and individual level factors to affect people's preferences, partisanship, and political behavior. He's widely published, and he's also a regular contributor to PBS's Media Shift. A winner of multiple classroom awards, Professor Wagner teaches courses in political communication, political behavior, the physiology of communication effects, and journalism. Seated next to him is Matthew DeFour, Twitter handle @WSJMattD4. Speaker. Okay. Matt has covered local, state, and national politics for more than a decade. Does that work? Better? Okay. It's Matt DeFour. He's covered local, state, and national politics for more than a decade. He got his first taste of presidential politics covering the 2004 Republican National Convention as a graduate student at Northwest University's Medill School of Journalism. At his first newspaper job in the Chicago suburbs, he broke the story that House Speaker Dennis Hastert had netted $2 million from a land deal near a highway for which he had earmarked federal funds. In 2006, he joined the Wisconsin State Journal, where he was part of the newspaper's Pulitzer finalist coverage of the 2011 protests over Act 10. In 2014, he received the Wisconsin Newspaper Association's top award for education reporting. To Matt's right is Patrick Marley. He started covering the state capitol for the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel in 2004. Before that, he covered local government for the Kenosha News. His work has been recognized by the Wisconsin Freedom of Information Council and the Wisconsin Newspaper Association. He holds a bachelor's degree in English from the University of Iowa and a master's degree in journalism from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. He's the co-author of More Than They Bargained For, a chronicle of the passage of Act 10. And to Patrick's right is Jessica Arp, Twitter handle @News3Jessica. She's the political reporter for WISC-TV News 3 in Madison. She's won numerous accolades and awards for political and breaking news coverage, including Best Online Personality by the Wisconsin Broadcasters Association, an Edward Murrow Award for her coverage of the recall of Governor Scott Walker, and a regional Emmy for coverage of Congressman Paul Ryan's vice presidential run. She's also been named one of the state's top political reporters, as well as a top political tweeter in Wisconsin by the Washington Post. I'd also like to thank WisPolitics.com, Isthmus, the Capital Times, and the Wisconsin State Journal for publicizing this event tonight. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to the panel. We're going to start with Patrick as the longest tenured political reporter here, and we'll hear from the three journalists, then we'll hear from Professor Wagner and turn it over for questions.
So hi, thanks for having me. Thanks to Mark and thanks to FPJ. Can't hear me.
I think you'll have. It should be on.
All right.
Yeah.
Can you hear me now? No. I don't know.
I don't.
No, I guess
No,
it is.
it's
All
not.
right. How about?
Really talk right into the top.
Hello. Okay. There we go.
Leave it to the tricky
All right. I'm gonna kiss the mic, I guess. So
It's a broadcaster almost to know.
yeah, believe me, she'll know more about that than I do. Thanks to Mark, and thanks to SPJ, and thanks to everybody for turning out here. Patrick Marley from the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel. I've been covering the state capitol since 2004. So started out in a Democratic administration, Governor Jim Doyle. Our paper has the advantage of, in covering Scott Walker, that we've got a lot of experience with him. I personally didn't cover him back when he was in the Assembly, but we have a lot of colleagues who were covering the Capitol when he was in the Assembly. And then, of course, he was a Milwaukee County executive, so in my early days there was a lot of county news out of his constant battles with the union. So we had a pretty good understanding of where he was coming from on issues that he later sort of launched him to national prominence. I covered the 2006 race, which, if you remember, Scott Walker ran in that race, dropped out early to make room for Mark Green. Can you not hear me? All right. So I was saying...
Tilt the microphone.
Yeah, there you go.
There we go?
Yeah,
all right.
that's gonna help.
Sorry.
Yes.
So covered Scott Walker going...
They're asking you to stand.
Oh. Technical debacle. Let's see, where was I? So covered Scott Walker going back to 2006 when he first ran for governor. He had a short run. He got out early to allow Mark Green to have a clear path challenging Jim Doyle. Doyle won re-election. Covered the 2010 race with my colleagues, and he won. It was a very interesting race. He won, and it became an even more interesting governorship because right away there was Act 10, and I think the rest has been sort of history for us in terms of the roller coaster ride we've been on since there. He's been a fascinating person to cover, even if he weren't running for president, which, despite what he says, he is doing. There's no doubt about that. So that's what I know about him.
Hi, I am Jessica Arp, as you said, from WISC. I started covering, I've been at Channel 3 for almost 11 years exactly. I started in 2004 doing a lot of general assignment stuff. I actually started on the political beat in the sort of late summer, fall of 2007, and you might remember that was when we had divided government in the state capitol, and there was a very long delay, like 3-some months on the state budget, and that's when I got started. We did a story where there was literally a clock ticking, and we showed calendar pages and everything, how long they were taking to get the state budget done. So what covered that, I first started covering Scott Walker. I can sort of remember very clearly when we started. I personally, since I started in 2007 covering politics, covered his 2010 run for governor, and the first time I did a sit-down interview was at our studios in October of 2009, and we talked about him running. He had done some events, I believe, at like Dane Manufacturing, if I'm remembering right, from the start, talking a lot about manufacturing and the brown bag concept, if a lot of you can remember that, in the 2010 campaign. So that was a big part of the campaign. That year, we sort of decided very specifically at our station that we were going to have people assigned. A lot of times in the past, they'd had the political reporter cover both sides of a campaign all the time. We tried to do something a little different that year, and so I was covering primarily Scott Walker, and someone else was covering primarily Tom Barrett. So I went to most of his events in the 2010 campaign and followed him all the way through. So it's been interesting, to say the least, obviously, to see the developments in the last 6 months or so, from the November election into where we are now, obviously, to watch it be sort of a conceptual thing that you talked about, possibly even in the debate, to now it being a very clear thing that's going forward, and us talking amongst ourselves. Are you going to Iowa this weekend? Are you going to New Hampshire next weekend? It's something that we have to decide as newsrooms on a weekly basis, like where we're going to go, where our affiliates going to be, what is he going to be talking about at these things, and it's something that's kind of developed, I think, for all of our newsrooms as we go along.
Hey Jess, would you just mind checking and see, is there a button on there that's turned off or on?
It's on. You just have to talk to right into the top of it.
Okay, it is turned on.
Yeah.
Is the volume not enough?
Yeah.
Just talking your big boy voice.
I'm going to talk
Big
boy
voice.
Is there, do we get,
I'll turn it.
okay. We might get a volume check here. I was going to say, based on the reaction,
There we go.
Based on the reaction from earlier, I wasn't sure if maybe I should talk more about Dennis Hastert than. But yeah, no, I've been a journalist for the last decade, covering things from. It was interesting. Just a brief side on Hastert. I was actually covering him when the Mark Foley scandal broke. That's been in the headlines lately because this was a Republican congressman from Florida who was at the time, I guess, accused of canoodling with page boys at the, and so I actually interviewed Dennis Hastert at his home right when that broke, and so I still have the audio recording from that, so I was listening to that today. I was kind of like, oh, interesting that I kept that. Yeah, I'm actually the greenest of the reporters here covering Governor Scott Walker. I've been doing the state capitol beat for a little bit more than 2 years. I was covering K-12 education prior to that and during the Act 10 protests and everything with that. So I was in the thick of things, obviously, covering the Madison School District. But I've only been covering the state government for the last 2 years. I covered the election in 2014. I was primarily covering Mary Burke, and I've also done a lot of economic reporting through the state capitol beat. So I've had a couple big stories. I was involved with D. Hall, who's here. Where's D? We did the Weedick story a couple of weeks ago on this $500,000 loan that Governor Walker's top aides have been pushing to this company that clearly, I think from our reporting, you can see they probably shouldn't have gotten the loan. And there's more to come on that. So I've been, interested in politics pretty much since high school. So this has all been it's been a real thrill just to be able to cover some of the most. Some of the biggest stories. I mean, it seems like Wisconsin is the center of the political universe for the last 5 years, and I've been to New Hampshire twice, I've been to Iowa twice, and I've been to South Carolina twice now. I was at CPAC, so I've really gotten a chance to cover the president. Well, it's not we're not even really in the official presidential election phase yet. We're still sort of in like the pre-process, but it's been kind of like a dream come true just to be able to be in that position covering presidential politics. So it's good to be doing that. So thanks.
I'm Mike Wagner. I'm the professor of the group, and so I have not had the experience of covering Governor Walker, and I'm very fascinated to hear what it is these three fine reporters have to say about it. And as a fan of Patrick and Jason Stein's book, I'm really excited to hear what people think has happened since Act 10 and as he's gotten into this presidential campaign. The research I do deals in kind of political communication and how the news media cover politics and how the way that happens influences or doesn't influence what we all do, think, reason, feel, and behave when it comes to elections and our general political views. And Mark asked me to talk for just a minute about the way Governor Walker has received kind of national media attention since his intentions have become known. And as I've been looking at that national coverage, it's been a real grab bag. The national media have cast a very wide net, but in some predictable categories that tend to happen with national media when covering someone like Governor Walker. And so one thing that they're doing is spending a lot of time trying to tell us the narrative of Governor Walker. Who is this guy, and is he presidential? Which is something that happens a lot in the coverage about him now. Is it a presidential answer that he gives on foreign policy questions, or is it something that, as Chuck Todd said on Meet the Press a few months ago, not ready for prime time? And so these are the kinds of things that are being bandied about the governor. That really have not much at all to do with what kind of president he would be. There's also a lot of stories about the money he's able to raise and the political support he's been able to use to be stronger than most little-known governors who are running for president. At this point in the race, 4 years ago and 8 years ago, Republicans who were in Governor Walker's shoes were far less well known than he is. And part of that is because he was able to raise national money during the recall. And so activists who are very important in terms of Republican primaries know who Governor Walker is in a way that they wouldn't have had he not been recalled. And so a lot of the stories about the governor say that, ironically, the recall helped set him up for this presidential run with respect to how he raises money. And then the last kind of area of coverage has been kind of the gotcha coverage. Do you think President Obama is a Christian kinds of questions that the governor got when he was in England. Or more recently, not really a gotcha situation, but the kind of kerfuffle over what he said about ultrasounds and how that filtered through the news media. Some things were taken out of context and kind of one thing that happens a lot in the national news media, if one national outlet reports it, Gail Collins on the op-ed page of the Times discusses it, other outlets pick it up and maybe don't do the fact-checking that they might do if it was their own story. And so that kind of thing has been happening a lot as well. And so the media so far haven't settled on a big theme of what it is the national media per se think of the governor. There's a lot of, he's a rugged individualist who takes on liberals. There's a lot of, does he know enough about foreign policy to be a serious candidate? And there's a lot of, he's been able to raise more money and is doing better in early polling than most folks who are like him are doing at this time. But I'll stop there, and I'm looking forward to your questions and these folks' answers.
One more thank you, and that's to the folks of the Wisconsin Union for pulling this room together real quickly. So, hey, that's great, and I know our panelists can take it. Assess local media coverage of Governor Walker, both as a governor and a presidential candidate, and then we'll hear from our journalists about that.
Okay, I would say that in the main, the coverage is thorough. We know what the governor is doing. We know what his positions are on issues. There's no mystery to where he stands when the news media want to figure out where it is that he stands on issues. I was just talking at dinner, Matthew and I went to dinner before this, and we were talking a bit about how the governor has not been very open with where he is recently and won't reveal whether he's in the state or out of the state. And so on the one hand, I think what the State Journal and the Journal Sentinel have done stories about that and revealed, we're not precisely sure where our governor is right now. But then, those seem to be one-day stories. And it seems to me that something like that, where is our governor, is something that we could probably see a lot more of in coverage. It would be useful to know, especially, and then maybe some stories that compared governors who run for president and their performance in office and their campaign. So comparing, say, Governor Walker to Governor George W. Bush and how those campaigns looked. How often was Governor Bush in Texas? How often was Governor Clinton in Arkansas? Things like that might be useful kinds of stories for us to get a sense of how does this look when other people try to do what it is Governor Walker is doing. And so I'd like to see more of that kind of thing. By and large, Wisconsin's news media has been tougher on Governor Walker than most states' news medias are on their governors, in terms of the kind of the tone of stories, in terms of not just quoting news releases. So one way we know this as in academics or in academia is to say, well, let's look at news releases that politicians release, and how often do quotes from the news release end up in stories. And fewer quotes from news releases end up in stories in Wisconsin than they do in news releases from governors in most other states. And so that's at least a baseline evidence that reporters aren't just taking the governor's word for it when they are covering him, which I think is a good thing. Another study I'm involved in, I don't know enough yet to know that this is my final view on the matter, but the project is one that takes kind of press pool reporting video and tries to just examine, do they ask follow-up questions? And in Wisconsin, there's not a lot of asking of follow-up questions. There might be one follow-up, and then another reporter wants their turn, and they might get their turn. And in Minnesota, where the only other place I have data so far, there seems to be there's a bit more following up with the governor. And so it's hard to know whether I just don't have enough data to know whether that's the truth or not, or whether the relationship that the reporters in Minnesota have with Governor Dayton is different than the relationship that reporters have in Wisconsin with Governor Walker is like. But it appears as though Governor Walker's oft-reported ability to deflect and talk about what he wants to talk about is on display in situations like that. So in terms of a negative, I would say that's one, but I also will kind of hedge my bet there and say I've only seen a little bit of the data that I want to see before I would draw a conclusion.
So, that's a good way to lead into our journals. What is it like to cover Governor Walker? What was it like to cover him as a governor? What's it like to cover him as a presidential candidate? And why the heck can't you get him off message?
Yeah, so a couple of things I wanted to respond to what Mike was saying. So we did do a story about how many times the governor has been out of state in the last, the first quarter of the year, and it was, we were not able to come, basically get him, get his political.
Speak closer.
No, not me, but the
What is going on? To do that story, we had to rely on our own ability, starting in mid-January, to track news clippings from around the country as to where he was. Because when we ask his Wisconsin office, where is Governor Walker today, they won't tell us. If they have an event, they will send us a press release the day before. For the most part, we know where he's
official event.
If he has an official event, I'm sorry, right. If he has an official event, we know where he is the day before, and we can go to the event. So this morning, he had an event in Delavan, where last night reporters were made aware of that, and if you wanted to go to that event, you could get him afterward for questions. And so, reporters went and they asked him questions about the arena deal and about the transportation deal and
Abortion.
and the 20-week abortion ban. And so he was accessible to reporters here in Wisconsin, as he has been many times, and he'll take as many questions. Not lately. In the past, he did. In the past, he would take questions basically until you were exhausted your questions. Since he's been since the re-election, and probably even during the campaign for the re-election, he was, at a certain point you'll ask questions. Reporters might jostle for which topic you're going to. They ask one or two follow-ups. So I don't know that I agree entirely that we're not asking follow-ups, because there definitely are. I mean, I know you definitely have to ask follow-ups to this governor because he has an answer prepared for the first question you ask. And so if you don't ask the follow-up, you're going to get sort of the pre, rehearsed question or answer. But and so we get that opportunity to ask those questions, and then his media handler will say one more question, and then depending on how many questions people still have, they might try to get a couple more in. But that's usually at that point things kind of fizzle down, and then he kind of just moves on, and it's not like we're chasing after him with microphones shoved in his face to try to get him to answer the fourth or fifth follow-up question. I've never seen that. I don't know if it happens, to Chris Christie, or I don't know how it happens in other states, but I don't know. You guys probably have additional responses, so let's keep going.
Yeah, I mean, really the only comparison I have of Governor Walker is to Governor Doyle. And if you look at Governor Walker for his first term, certainly far more times that he would have media availabilities and for longer periods of time in general. I mean, one thing I think it's important to note is during Act 10, when he had tens of thousands, sometimes as many as 100,000 people on the Capitol lawn protesting, every day he had a press conference. He would take questions from people. You could hear the protesters by there. That is not something that I ever saw Jim Doyle did when was it 2009 was the first Tea Party protest, which had a couple thousand people on the Capitol Square. Could not get the governor no matter what. So very different in style. Since the re-election, it's been a lot different, and it's changed a lot in just a few months since then. There was a period early this year where it seemed very difficult to get Governor Walker. He was going through his, he was sort of being looked at on his foreign policy credentials and finding that he didn't know a lot or wouldn't say a lot. He got the evolution question in England that didn't go well. He made it said he didn't know if the president was a Christian or not. And it seemed like each time he would say something like this, he would just disappear. And it was very unusual for him, given how available he had been. I would say in the last month or 6 weeks, he's sort of returned to form and had more frequent availabilities in Wisconsin, though he's in Wisconsin less, as Mike was saying. But when you get him, like he was in Portage the other day, and I think we had maybe 14 minutes. Were you there, Jessica?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we have 14 minutes, and so it is true that there's a competitive nature. Out of Milwaukee. We're very interested in this Bucks Arena deal. It's in our backyard, something that's important to the city, something very controversial in terms of who's for it, who's against it. We were starting to get details. We wanted to pin the governor down. Other reporters are not as interested in it because it's not in their backyard, and they want a chance to ask their questions, so they're not going to try to follow up on my questions, and I'm not going to follow up on theirs in general because I'm working on my story. I think that you'd see more back and forth if we had the comfort of more time, and it's just sort of the nature of the business sometimes.
Yeah, I'd say it kind of comes and goes. I mean, that, and you also, have the thing, like the Bucks Arena deal. I mean, that Portage scenario is a pretty good example of it. That day, I was working on a story about prevailing wage, so I needed a couple questions about prevailing wage. He needs 2 or 3 on the arena deal, and on some days, I mean, I could think the day that when we were covering the Republican convention in La Crosse a few weeks ago, I think that availability was like 4 minutes. I think there were a total of, I think reporters maybe got a total of 4 to 5 questions in that day. And that, you might remember, was the day after the governor announced that he wanted to suspend the loan program at WEDC. So there were a lot of questions that people had about that, and Matt was working on the loan story clearly for the next day. So, I mean, it's really difficult for all of us to get in the follow-up questions that we would love to get in when you have all of these reporters who are all working on that. So that's sort of the challenge you get with that. I do think, too, you have to wonder if there's a concerted effort now to try to get more availabilities in Wisconsin because of the coverage of where has he been, is he doing things in Wisconsin, is he plugged into the budget process, because there's so many questions about the budget right now. I mean, the day that the governor signed the right to work measure in Milwaukee, he took no questions from reporters after that event. He gave prepared remarks on a manufacturing floor. Afterwards, I mean, there was a whole riser full of reporters. Everyone came down and waited for him. And the thing was, we were told his schedule was really tight that day. And so we all waited, and we're going to, sort of grab him on the way out. And he walked by us and said, my remarks speak for themselves, and walked past us and didn't take any questions. But he shook hands with the other lawmakers who were there for about 5 or 7 minutes, something like that, if you counted. So, it really depends on the day and that ability to follow up. Everybody really wants that ability to follow up, but you can, if you ever, if you're watching the raw footage of us questioning him afterwards, you might see, I mean, I was thinking about Portage the other day too. I think somebody asked a question about transportation at the same time Dee was asking a question about the loan, and he says, I'll go here, then I'll go here, he says. So trying to make sure it's somewhat equitable, that all 15 reporters who are there get at least one question in that they want about the budget. So it's a difficult dance that we all do every day, but when everybody, when I'm told by my newsroom, go ask about transportation funding and prevailing wage, and he's told to go ask about the Bucks Arena, and he's told to follow up on his Weedick story, we all get in a pinch where it's well, when you get 6 minutes with a person, how many questions can you conceivably ask in that time too?
Can I just say one more?
Yeah.
One other thing I'd say is that Scott Walker makes way more news than Mark Dayton. And so when there's a press conference, it's there's 6 or 8 newsworthy things that you can ask him about, and I don't follow Minnesota politics that much, but it's not, I mean, they don't have on the plate the kinds of things we do, a presidential run, a trip to Israel, a Weedick challenges, an arena deal. It's just, there's maybe... right. I mean, Minnesota has its budget, and I'm sure it has many complicated and controversial things in it. But
The university.
Yeah.
Right. Name your issue. I mean, you make my point.
Last question for me, and then we'll turn it over to the audience. Do you see a different Scott Walker? Each of you has traveled Iowa, South Carolina, New Hampshire, Washington, D.C. Do you see a different Scott Walker out in those areas than you do here?
I think we probably definitely did from the first Iowa Freedom Summit in that we went to in Iowa, which was in February. Sorry, January. There's too many of these things. I mean, that day we saw this rolled up sleeves guy who is just raring to go on stage, which is someone that, covering someone through a whole 2014 campaign. You didn't see that kind of fire in his eyes, I don't think, that you saw that day. And you also heard him touting things that you did not hear him tout regularly on the campaign trail in 2014. You heard him talk about defunding Planned Parenthood. You heard him talk about voter ID, which you sometimes heard about, but not a lot. I mean, there were social issues that we were talking about, which clearly was what the crowd was there to hear about. It's what a lot of the candidates were talking about. But it wasn't the main narrative that we had heard the entire time. It wasn't jobs, it wasn't the unemployment rate. We heard those talking points, but we heard some of the other pieces of it too.
I agree with Jessica, but I think that the reason you hear him say different things in other states than Wisconsin is not so much because he's in a different state, but because he's speaking to the base. He's running in a presidential primary. He needs to win the GOP nomination, and so he is talking about those things like Planned Parenthood and abortion laws and voter ID and concealed carry always gets a mention. He's talking about those things because he's talking to Republicans who are diehard Republicans. He needs to get that base vote. It's similar if you listen to him on Charlie's side. So if he's in an editorial board of the Journal Sentinel, he's going to talk about issues in a slightly different way than if he's on Fox News. And so I think it's about his audience.
And I was going to bring up, because sort of part and parcel of that is there a difference in the way he handles the media in those other states because he does these same kind of press gaggles, very similar setup. People are kind of crushing around him, and his demeanor is very similar in the way he answers questions to the way it is here. But it can be frustrating at times when you're a reporter from Wisconsin who's heard the answer numerous times to some of these questions, and you still get you get some national reporter up there who just gets in there and asks, so why do you think you'd be a good president? It's just like, we don't need to hear that answer again. So yeah, I mean, it's just a different. You got to deal with not just him being a little bit different in the way he presents himself, but there's all these other challenges from the national media having different objectives too. So,
is that a question you could address, or?
I'll be quick.
Yeah.
I agree with I think Patrick's point about I think Governor Walker's very astute at knowing who his audience is and how he's going to speak to that particular audience, and I think he has been on a bit of a learning curve when it comes to dealing with issues that he didn't regularly deal with as the governor of Wisconsin. So he might not always talk abortion or concealed carry or things like that on the Wisconsin campaign trail, but he was conversant in those issues and had answers ready for the national media on those. When it came to other issues that he wasn't as used to dealing with as the governor, I think he struggled a bit with the national media, and I think his campaign has been surprised at how quickly a phrase can be shot around the globe in a way that he hadn't experienced it, even during Act 10, I think, in some ways. And so I think, I think one of the reasons we saw so much less of the governor, I would speculate, is that they're working on how to deal with those kinds of questions.
So we don't have a microphone that'll run up and down the aisle, and we'll try and get to as many questions as possible. When I call on you, stand up, state your question. I'll repeat it so that the rest of the audience can hear it, and I think I'll try and distill it. Ma'am?
Yes, I'd like to know which one of you, or if any of you, is conversant in the John Doe investigations and follow up with that.
I think they all could address it.
Okay.
All can address John Doe.
Good.
And do you have a particular question in regard to the John Doe investigation?
I'd like to know the status of the John Doe right now with the last ruling from the court, and he's thinking he can go ahead and do whatever he wants.
Okay, so what's the status of the John Doe investigation? And then let's just take it one step further. Is it going to have any impact on his presidential run?
Okay, well, so there were two John Does. We'll quickly go through the John Doe one, which is closed. That was an investigation that looked into it resulted in 6 convictions, but it looked into a number of things regarding Walker's aides and associates. He was never charged with anything. Had a couple of aides from his time as Milwaukee County Executive who were doing political work from his county executive office, and they were convicted of that. There were some other sort of there was some stealing from a veterans fund. There was some donor issue where a donor was paying employees to make political contributions. That was shut down. And right away, another John Doe was launched with more focus, and that is on campaign finance laws and whether the governor's campaign illegally cooperated or coordinated with independent groups, specifically the Wisconsin Club for Growth and some others, Wisconsin Manufacturers and Commerce. That has faced many legal challenges. I think at one point I counted up to 8 lawsuits about that probe or related campaign finance laws challenging it. The investigation has been halted a year and a half ago when the judge who oversaw it said that even if the issues that were being looked into, if all the facts that prosecutors believed were true, no crime would have been committed. And so now it's sitting before the state Supreme Court. They should rule in June. It's feasible it won't be till July. And whether it will have an effect on his presidential campaign, I think will largely hinge on what the Supreme Court says. The Supreme Court is going to either shut this thing down for good, or they're going to allow prosecutors to reopen their investigation. I mean, I suppose there's some other outcome, but it appears those are really one of those two things will happen. If it's shut down, he'll be able to cry victory, and I think it's just a footnote in the presidential run. If they're allowed to reopen an investigation just as he's launching his presidential bid, you can bet that that will remain a story that will dog him for much of the campaign.
I would even go so far as to suggest that, I mean, having covered him for these last 3 months and having covered the reaction that he gets among the base and among people who are really invested in the Republican Party, and you see his poll numbers, I almost wonder if it's something like the John Doe investigation continuing that would like that's the kind of thing that would knock him off the high horse he's been on for the last 4 or 5 months. I mean, when he goes to these events, it's not like he's disappointing anybody. The activists come out, they see him, and they're even more enthused about him. They constantly are putting him in the top 1 or 2 positions in these straw polls. So it's almost as if if the John Doe investigation fizzles out, I mean, that's the kind of thing that is really almost standing in his way to, I think, just continuing to roll toward the nomination. And then obviously there's obviously a lot of other people in the race. Who knows what's going to happen in the debates, and there's any number of things that could come out. But it's going to take that. It's not like people are just going to get to know him and all of a sudden realize, oh, maybe I'm not so excited about him. It seems like he's getting that enthusiasm to follow him along the way. So.
I guess the other thing that I would say about it is, I mean, you see how long it sort of takes to explain what this is about and how it works. I mean, these are very nuanced issues. It's not like, somebody's been embezzling. It's not a cut and dry criminal case. It's a very complicated, nuanced thing, and I think it's difficult for some people to really wrap your head around. I mean, I say as a TV reporter who gets probably less time and space to talk about some of this than these guys do, it's hard to get it into a digestible format for people on TV to do. And I mean, what the Supreme Court will decide will have a lot of impact on what is next on it. But no matter what, it's a really hard thing, I think, for most people to understand. And it's very, like, when you hear it on its face, a lot of people who don't like the governor think, like, oh, he's being investigated, that must mean he's crooked. For people who really like the governor think he's being investigated, that must mean it's a witch hunt. It's very, like, people have heard investigation and they make their own assumptions either way without knowing a whole lot about what it's all about and the very meat of it that has to do with technical issues and state campaign finance law and all of that kind of stuff. So whether it has an impact might also hinge on whether people can really understand what's going on and whether it has like a greater impact on laws in the state and how people actually conduct campaigns at all, I think.
Have you, the question I had as I'm listening to these folks is, are you seeing national media writing about John Doe, and what do you see?
No, not really. There hasn't been very many national stories, and a lot of the ones that have been written, I say a lot, and this is a small number, maybe on one hand you could count them, a lot of them are appearing in more right-leaning press, so the American Conservative or Commentary, something like that, and there, it's more, I think Jessica hit the nail on the head. If you're a fan of the governor, this is a liberal witch hunt. And we're going to write stories that protect you from that liberal witch hunt. And I think that's what we're seeing more from the national stage so far. Now, if something else comes out, if there's a new decision, I think as Patrick quite rightly said, or if there's some incontrovertible evidence that the governor himself has done something, wrong, then maybe it would be a story. But otherwise, people who support the governor are going to dismiss this as something his political opponents are putting forth.
I think I remember seeing a New York Times article when the latest John Doe document dump, and which is what we call it when they release, 1,000 or 10,000 pages of emails that we all have to look through at 5 o'clock on a Friday night while you all are going to fish fries. And there was really nothing in there that we thought was very interesting, but we saw a story in the New York Times the next day, which more or less told us everything, or told us things that we already knew. Yes, sir.
My question is a similar one regarding Wisconsin events and whether or not they'll have an effect on a national presidential campaign. My question would be specifically about the WEDC, and do you think that will ultimately have much effect, particularly if there's going to be an audit or criminal prosecution in the case?
The question has to do with the Wisconsin Economic Development Corporation and whether the issues surrounding it will be will become a national story as the governor considers a presidential run. To repeat, Matt and Dee Hall wrote a story about a $500,000 loan that Walker's top aides pressed for, and this company that got the loan was at the time basically going under and hasn't repaid the loan, and the state has now had to go back and try and sue for that money.
Yeah, so I can tell you that there is a thought among even other campaigns, other Republicans running for president, that is the kind of thing that could cause problems for Walker's potential candidacy. But the story that we did, for example, hasn't really been picked up nationally. It's obviously it got a lot of attention here in Wisconsin, but I think there's this interest at the national level in somebody trying to wrap it all together in one big narrative. And the story that we did is clearly there's some issues that it raised, but I think as I was telling Patrick, like when right before it came out, that it's kind of like it's not exactly a direct hit on Governor Scott Walker. It's kind of like it obviously raised a lot of questions about Mike Hipsch's activity, the governor's office, and the governor has said he wasn't aware of this loan. So we're continuing to look into this. We're continuing to investigate things related to it, and we'll see if there's more. We'll find out if there is more that the governor knew and was involved with. But at this point, it really is more about this agency that he created and that he was the chairman of. And again, I think a lot of people are asking that question. Certainly, Democrats are asking about his role. But for the most part, he's been. It seems like he's been sort of on the side, or he just by sort of professing this sort of ignorance of these issues, it's almost like for the people who love him, they're just kind of like, oh well, I don't know. It doesn't seem like that they're all of a sudden turning on him for these things, but I don't know that anything would necessarily turn supporters of Scott Walker on him. So.
Just to illustrate what Matt said about the national media, not yet picking this up, our newspaper put together a whole page on its website of our coverage of WEDC, and I went to Twitter and I said, for all your background on WEDC, go to this web page, and the Washington Post reporter who has been covering Governor Walker said, "Wait, what's WEDC?" So that was her response on Twitter. Anybody else want to address?
So this isn't about WEDC per se, but it's about how the national news media cover presidential campaigns. And this isn't my own work. This is from a book by Kathleen Hall Jameson called The Press Effect. But one thing that happens is that on presidential campaigns, national news media tend to look for stories that confirm what reporters already think about the candidate. And their examples were in 2000, The narrative of George W. Bush was that he wasn't bright enough to be president, and the narrative about Al Gore was that he was a liar. And when George W. Bush stretched the truth, that wasn't a story, because it wasn't his narrative, and when Al Gore did, it was a story. And when George W. Bush mangled the English language, that was a story, and when Al Gore did, it wasn't a story. And so if a narrative develops about Governor Walker with respect to corruption or failed governance, or if his opponents start bringing up problems in Wisconsin, and this is just another example of those kinds of problems, then I think we might see something. But in and of itself, I think that what everybody said is quite right.
Can I just answer that? One thing Mike just said that made me think, we are all fortunate in having covered Governor Walker from the start, and we've sort of seen these things develop and written daily stories about them and weekend stories, maybe taken a month to do an investigation, but you know all these facts, and I pity the national reporter who all of a sudden they're told, you get to cover Scott Walker, all of a sudden he's at the top of the game, go write about him, and it's like, oh yeah, by the way, there were two investigations, one sprawling into like all kinds of things, the other unresolved. 2/3 of the court documents in the cases are blacked out. It's on these absolutely obscure portions of campaign finance law. And he set up this, this WISC agency, and it's had all these problems, and there are audits. I mean, you're just sort of overwhelmed. So I feel like we have this great advantage at this moment that we can kind of be on the forefront of everything and just let the national media catch up to us. And at some point, I'm sure we'll get our comeuppance, but for now, we're in a good shape.
I'd say the other thing is, we all know the power of political ads, right? And we're not necessarily to the phase of this campaign where, like, the parties start eating their own. So, like, once we get to that point where they start attacking each other, like, who knows? Who knows what somebody could turn a WEDC story into an attack ad that is suddenly very effective or very not effective. Who knows? But that, I would say that might be what we have to wait and see, is who uses this as an attack and how.
Sorry, you had one.
First, I'd like to make a comment and then a question. Wisconsin's been
Why don't you go ahead?
Wisconsin's been a state for 167 years, and you asked the question of where is the governor? Well, the governor, if he wants to run for president, then he ought to run for president, and we ought to understand that he may be out of the state. It's been 167 years, and we've never had a legitimate presidential candidate. That's a good thing, just like it was when Paul Ryan was a candidate for vice president. I do not support those individuals, but I think it's history in the making that we have people in our state who are making that type of news nationally and doing that type of thing. So get over it. Get over it, people. Get over it, media. My question, though, and the gentleman said something about lying. I believe it was in this weekend's Journal Sentinel, where there was a report, and I'm now talking about facts, but I may not have all my facts correct, so perhaps you'll forgive me and correct me. But I think it was reported that if it was Politico or the Political Fact Check had indicated that the governor has been shown to have either been pants on fire or false as many as 12 or more times. I think I'm close on that, right?
Sounds plausible. Sounds
Okay.
like a ballpark.
So my challenge to you folks who know him best, how tough are you on acknowledging the fact that he's pants on fire, false, and demonstrating that to those of us who are citizens of this state? And how are you reporting it when it comes to reporting it so that the people of this nation know that this governor who's running for president makes false statements, pants on fire statements, as many as 12 or so times?
Thank you. Good question.
I'll give that to Patrick first and everybody else.
Thanks for your comment and question. First, your comment. You have many governors who are running, or thinking about running, and I'm sure they're getting the same kind of scrutiny in their home state. Is Chris Christie paying enough attention to New Jersey, or is he off fundraising and doing these things? And there's no way to run for president and not make a lot of visits to early primary states. Anybody's got to do it, and of course, it's going to be a question for his constituents back home. Is he doing his job as governor in addition to being president? And he has said a number of times, look, I have to do a good job of being governor, because if the state goes off the cliff, then I can't be a presidential candidate. Now, there's going to be disagreements because Democrats hate him so much, they'll say the state has already gone off a cliff. But, I think his point is well taken, that, governing is a central part of his campaign. And the reason that he's doing as well as he is because as a Republican, he's been very successful in Wisconsin in passing the Act 10 reforms, all these things that are red meat to the base. He's done very well with that. So the Journal Sentinel has a feature called PolitiFact as part of a national organization that rates the statements of public officials. Governor Scott Walker is absolutely the person who gets fact-checked the most of anybody out of Wisconsin. So while it is true that he's had perhaps a dozen statements that have been rated false or pants on fire, he's getting checked a lot more often than the Democratic leaders of the legislature, for instance. So do we point that out? Absolutely point that out. We have a graphic with flames that's called Pants on Fire that's on, prominently displayed, sometimes on our front page. In daily coverage, if the governor makes a misstatement of fact, we sort of, at the Journal Sentinel, we have two options. We can say the governor said this, and then in the next paragraph say that's not accurate. Or we can say, I'm not going to quote that, I'm going to hand it off to PolitiFact. That's kind of how we deal with those things.
So at Channel 3, we have a franchise that we use most often during election season called Reality Check. We do political ads a great deal. I've used them for speeches. I've used them for statements. So we're the only TV station that I'm aware of in the state that's doing political ad or doing fact-checking work on broadcast television. It's me. I'm a team of one that does all the research, that puts everything together, and I have really great photographers that do graphics and things that go along with it. So I think Political Fact has, three reporters. Three reporters that are working on that stuff all the time. So, and we're not doing it just for Governor Walker, what we have done, when he does the State of the State address, we'll pull out the State of the State address from last year. What did he promise that he was going to do? Did he do those things? What did he, take a victory lap about? Did that happen the way he said it happened? So we're trying as hard as we can in a day-to-day news coverage basis to try to address some of the true, false, misleading. Most of the time it's somewhere in a gray area. There are times that I really wish I had a pants on fire label to put on things. We use true, false, misleading, and needs clarification, and most things show up in the middle of those two. So, we're doing our best, and then, I think when you look at PolitiFact, because PolitiFact is a national organization, every pants on fire rating, every mostly true or true rating, it all goes on a national website besides just going on Milwaukee Journal Sentinel's website as well. So I think, as you see, and this is maybe a to-be-seen thing, but as you see, national media pick up on some of these things, so, they'll go back and do their research, or you would hope so, go back and look and see who said what does the ad say. I think we probably, I'm pretty sure I'd have to go back and look because there were so many of them, but that we looked at the ad where his right to choose. What did he say about this? What was the bill? He says, but we passed a law that made it,
patient safety.
What was it? The safety of the woman. And we talked about the law. Well, wait a minute. This needs clarification. This is what this law did. This is what it said. This is what it requires. So some of that stuff, it lives online. Generally, forever now. That stuff's out there. If anybody.
There are two thoughts that came to mind. One, it seems like I can't tell if the point that you're making is that, if we were covering Scott Walker, and every day he had a blowtorch, and he was working with metal, and we just described that activity, or are you looking for us to say, oh, he's welding today, or are you looking for us to say, oh, he's a welder? I don't think you're ever going to see the newspaper just call him a straight out welder. We're not going to be oh, Governor Walker, he's a giant welder. It's we're not going to do that. But do we put in context the facts he's got the blowtorch and he's got the metal, and so and you guys can figure out whether he's a welder or not. So that's kind of the difficulty, is that we're not just going to call people names, I guess. But the other thought I had was that I am surprised by how many people I talk to in other states when they don't know Governor Walker as well as people in this room, people in Wisconsin. And I hear a lot of people, when I ask them, why do you like Governor Scott Walker? Why are you planning to support him, or why do you think he's doing so well in the polls. And so many people I talk to say they think he's an honest person. They say his honesty. And I was expecting that kind of reaction from this room. I was talking to Mike about this. Like, there was one gentleman I was talking to in South Carolina a couple weeks ago, who was telling me like he's just really impressed by how Governor Scott Walker was able to work with the Democratic legislature in Wisconsin to get things done. And in this case, I actually said, he's never had a Democratic legislature. It's always been a Republican legislature. But I worry sometimes about those situations. Is it my job to, give them a lecture on, actually, here's what's going on in Wisconsin? I don't, or is it my job to collect information about what people in other states are saying? You guys apparently think I'm supposed to be giving people lectures, so I don't know, maybe I should become a professor or something. But no, I don't know that, again, I think your expectation, maybe everyone's expectation is when I'm at these events, I'm talking to people, I should be like, when somebody says, I really like, how honest this guy is. I think your expectation is I'm like, he's a welder. But I don't, that's not, I don't think that's my responsibility. And so, but what we do in our stories, for example, the other day, Dee Hall had a story where she was in Portage asking about this WISC loan, and his response about his top aide, Mike Hipsch, the Department of Administration Secretary, pushing for this loan is, oh no, this is just a normal thing that he did where he passed it along. We, in our story the next day, pointed out specifically that the former WISC Secretary told us that this was a very unusual thing for him to be doing, that this is not something that he did normally, and that this is the only time that he could think of when Mike Hipsch became an advocate. So in that story, we put both of those things in there. We say, here's what he said, and here's the information that we have to supplement that. And again, the public can make their own decision as to whether he's a welder or not. So.
Excuse me, I'd like a follow-up. These people like follow-ups?
Sure. Let Professor Wagner respond for one second.
I'll be quick. So first, to the comment, I don't think anybody said that they were upset Governor Walker was campaigning or not being in the state. I think the only thing I raised was we have the right to know where he is. And then people can decide for themselves whether they think he should be here or there and judge the history of it. But knowing where he is different than judging where he is, I think. And then with respect to the question about kind of the different labels of truth, mostly true, pants on fire, I think one thing to keep in mind is that when anyone, Governor Walker or any politician or anybody who speaks publicly is labeled by PolitiFact as pants on fire, their reaction is not to say, yes, I'm a terrible liar, I'm so sorry. Their reaction is to say, this is a biased judgment, this isn't correct, here's other reasons that I'm not a liar, and this is just another example of the media attacking truth, justice, and the American way. And so it's not as though the rating from PolitiFact is the end-all, be-all of how things go. Politics is contested, and the person getting attacked rarely takes that judgment in stride and changes their life.
All right, sir.
Well, yes, Mr. DeFour, I think your response to me was a bit demeaning about the welder comment. And I guess the question I was trying to ask of you reporters is, when you look at yourself and you look at what you're reporting, when you know that the governor is being false, if you know the governor is pants on fire, that it's your obligation to report it to those of us who read your papers, who listen to your station. And I was looking for you to be somewhat self-aware as to how well you're doing and how well your colleagues are doing in doing that. Because if I have to read the Journal on Sunday to find out that he's pants on fire and false, then I think you're doing a disservice to your viewers and your readers if you're not telling us that yourselves. And it's not about being a welder. It's whether facts are facts and whether the governor is being false and whether he's being pants on fire.
Matt, do you want to respond with that?
Yeah, and I was being kind of glib to get around the idea of calling the governor a liar. I don't think it's our job to put in a newspaper. I think
report the truth.
I think what I explained though is how we do that, and the way we do that is we present what the governor says, and then we present facts that contradict that. Do we say, in the next paragraph, thus the governor was lying about this? Or do we say...
I wasn't saying that you ought to report that he's a liar or not. Report the truth.
I think we've tried to do that when we can and when we have the information that can back up facts.
So is there an example, sir, that you can think of when you've seen any of these journalists here or anybody else report something that you would consider blatantly false?
I have to say that I'm not in the state that these individuals are in terms of covering the governor.
Sure.
Every day of my life, and it's not my profession.
Right.
All I know is that I read what I read in the paper, that a dozen or more times the governor's pants on fire are false. And I'd like to know with confidence that the papers that I subscribe to and the station that I view as often as I do will be forthcoming and reporting those things without saying he was a liar, but being able to help me understand when the governor said something that was not true.
Okay, so the question is, the audience member wants reassurance that when he reads something in a newspaper, watches a TV station, that they're reporting on sort of factual statements and not perpetuating false statements. And why is there a PolitiFact that tells us that the governor or any other politician said something that may have been untrue, that there might be a lag time, say, might have been reported last week, but then several days later, PolitiFact tells me that statement was untrue. Fair characterization?
And trying to be just self-aware of how well are they doing, because the premise is maybe they're not doing well enough.
Okay. Why don't you...
Sure, and I appreciate your comment. I think that all of us got into this business and became political reporters because we see an important thing for people to have, to be able to make the kinds of decisions that people need to make in a democracy. They need to have all the facts. And public officials need to be held accountable. I think we're all committed to that, and we try to do that as best we can. If a public official makes an outlandish statement, I think any of us are going to pounce on that story and write it. There are a lot of times where we see PolitiFact as being a very helpful supplement because the governor or anyone else might give a 30 or 40-minute speech. And in that speech, they might say 12 interesting things. And there's only so much room in a story. And along the way, they maybe say something questionable or get their facts wrong, but it's not really central to the story at hand. So that gives us an opportunity to say, the governor said these 3 things that he's going to do in the state budget that are important for people to know, and I wasn't able to get to this other element, but now I've got this other part of the newspaper that can take a look at that. But if the governor, if the most important thing out of the governor's speech is making a whopper of a misstatement, then that would be the lead of the story.
So one quick example, and I guess I would say to start out with, all we can have control over, even if you can really say we have control over it, because we're all reporters. We're not necessarily editors or news directors. We have control over what we do every day. And I can ask for, and I can, campaign, maybe is probably the wrong word, or I can advocate for a story and how I want to do a story, and if a news director overrules me, that's what happens. But a very brief example I can give you of us trying to be self-aware of how we're doing something was when Paul Ryan gave his convention speech when he accepted the vice presidential nomination in Tampa. He talked specifically about GM in Janesville, and he made a statement about President Obama and the timing of a statement in there. And the next morning, when we were covering, we covered his comments that night, and the next day, I advocated very strongly, even though I knew it was going to be kind of a technical nightmare, that our story needed to be a reality check on that speech, because there were things that he said in that speech that had a questionable timeline to it, that we needed to tell people, was that right, or what was the timeline? When was President Obama in Janesville? Could he have had an influence on the decisions that were made there? So luckily, they went ahead and said, okay, let's do it, and we did it even though it caused a lot of, bless my managers for saying it was okay, but we felt really strongly that, especially because we have viewers in Janesville who knew how it happened that day, that we went ahead and said, here's what he said, here's how we believe this is misleading because here's how it actually happened. When you saw other coverage in other places of this, and this is a self-awareness situation, it was union members in Janesville are upset about something that Paul Ryan said, and Republicans believe it was all just fine. that was what the coverage was in some other places in the interest of, and I'm all about in the interest of being balanced and presenting a balanced story, but the story was about the conflict that it had created in a community and not about whether what he said was right or wrong, whether the timeline of what he said was accurate. And we tried hard that day to say, look, something he said that day was somewhat misleading. Here's how it actually happened. You can decide if it's how you want to judge what he said. Here's just what you should know about the situation. So, we're well aware that there's people who do great on days and there's people who do not so great on days. And I'm guilty as charged of that. But I think people are trying at least to be self-aware of how can we do better? What can we be the most relevant to you when you see us or you read us? And you can decide for yourself what you want to do with that information. But we are going to give you facts instead of just shouting.
Professor, can you address the fact-checking question? We'll get you, Bill.
Sure. I would say one issue that I think it's important to think about as we understand fact-checking is kind of a new thing in terms of like these independent sites and now partnering with news organizations doing this. It's relatively new in the history of American journalism. But the thing I think that's important to think about is that most political facts are not as cut and dried as we would like them to be, right? So when Paul Ryan made a statement and we can know, well, was the president even the president when this factory closed? Or that's a fact that's pretty incontrovertible. But when Governor Walker says, under my leadership, Wisconsin's had the strongest economic growth of all of the states in the Midwest, and when Mary Burke in the next ad on television says Wisconsin is dead last in the Midwest, both of those are true depending upon what you count and when you start counting. And PolitiFact's website, I think the Journal Sentinel, went through that in great detail. So Governor Walker can say from this date forward using this metric, Wisconsin is doing great. And Mary Burke can say from this date forward using this metric, Wisconsin is dead last. And it's very difficult to tell that story, and it's also very difficult to fact check those kinds of claims that are less cut and dried as most things that, it's not mathematics. It's not Governor Walker said 2 + 2 was elephant. That's not how these kinds of things tend to work.
On this question of honesty, I get that you're not supposed to say words like he's a liar in a news story. Nobody wants you to do that. But here in this room, I think people came because they want the benefit of your perspective on this guy as someone who's had interactions with him that most people haven't. And in that spirit, on this question of honesty, just answer this. Is Scott Walker, in your estimation, based on your experience, an honest person? I mean, discuss what his relationship is with the truth and the facts, and whether it should be troubling or whether it should be comforting.
Thank you.
Thank you. That was a good one.
Who wants to address that one?
All right. Here's my take on that question. Governor Walker is a politician, and he is an extremely good politician, and I say that in the sort of the technical aspects. I mean, this is something he's been doing for his entire life. His entire adult life, basically, is running for political office. So, when you're coming to this idea of is he an honest person, he knows how to use political language to, get a certain idea across. And he has very strong beliefs about, we've actually done stories about how he's been, again, sort of shifting his positions on things. But you can still tell when he talks to these national media outlets that he is trying to sort of fit them all, sort of put this square peg in a round hole sometimes of how what he said before doesn't quite contradict. So I think he's got some kind of sense of, not wanting to just be a complete, again, a complete welder. But he is. He's using language, and he's using, when he's, which audience you're talking to, and he's using just all these different calculations about the political process, I think, to try to get people to vote for him and follow him. And some people would look at that and say that's despicable, and other people like what he's putting out and say, oh, I like what this guy's selling, I'm going to go for it. And I think that's just how politics works. So is he, again, I don't think we want to, like you said, come up with that final judgment, but I mean, he's definitely, trying to sell you something. So, do you believe everything you see on TV? I don't know.
This is the time of the show where we're sort of like, we become the politicians and we get very, we start giving political answers, because I'm not, going to weigh in on those kinds of things. But I would say that, he is a politician, and I don't know that his relationship with the truth is markedly different than that of many other politicians. And that is to say that, the example Mike was giving, I think, are the kinds of things you tend to see from politicians, that where data is cherry-picked, and you saw Mary Burke do it too. They take the data that's best to make their case. Is it the most honest way to present this, the status of the economy of Wisconsin? Probably not. Is it a lie? No. And so, it's... their job is to make their case to get as many votes as they can. Our job is to translate that into the facts, and we try to do that every day, and sometimes we have success and sometimes we don't.
Yeah, I got a toddler to put to bed. I think I need to go. Well, I think some people might not like the answer to this question, but to decide whether or not he's honest, I don't think that's my job. I just don't. My job is to tell you what he said, and you get to decide whether you think he's honest or not. That's how I view what I do every day. I'm fully aware that some people don't agree with that, but that's how I feel, and that's what I think. I wholeheartedly agree with Matt that this is someone who knows what to say and how to say it to get his point across every day. I look at the ads and how people put ads together. We look at speeches and how he gives them and how he says things. And you talk to some of the people behind the scenes, and he's very well aware of how he said something 10 times before he said it to you today, and he's going to stick with that same line as long as it's still working for him. So I think we have to tell you what he said. Has he said the same thing every time? Did he change that? Did he say something different to this crowd in New Hampshire than he said today? But I don't think it's necessarily my job to sit here and tell you if I think he's an honest person. Do I know if Patrick's an honest person? I don't know.
Check my credits.
So, Professor Wagner, are those fair responses to Bill's question?
I think they're the responses I was expecting, and if I was in their shoes, that's what I would say, and I'm sort of in their shoes now, and that's more or less what I'll say. I don't know whether Governor Walker is an honest person, and the reason I don't know is because I don't know what he really thinks. I know what he tells us, and then I can compare what he tells us to what he does, and to the extent that he does what he says he's going to do, we can call that honesty, but, I think there are other ways to think about honesty. We can think about President Obama on the campaign trail saying, I don't support same-sex marriage, and then I evolved on the issue, and now I do. I personally think he probably was always for it and thought it wasn't politically expedient to say so. Was he dishonest? Probably in that case, I think so. But I don't know whether that's the case with Governor Walker on some of the issues where he's taking a position that's different than ones he took before. And so he is not been wild about ethanol in the past, and the more time he spends in Iowa, the more he's warming up to the joy that ethanol brings to all humans on this great planet. And so, is that dishonest? I think Jessica and Patrick and Matthew's job, as I think Jessica said, to say this is what he said about ethanol at time A, this is what he says now. What happened in between? He decided he was running for president. You can use that information however you wish as you decide what you think about the governor.
It's also whether he's honest, I think, is an opinion that people form. And so our job isn't to opine. Our job is to, again, present the facts. So
Okay, a lot of questions.
Yeah.
Sir.
Just when he said in his first gubernatorial campaign that he would negotiate in good faith with public employees, and then he comes out with Acts 10 that deprives people of the fundamental human right to form unions and negotiate for wages, hours, and working conditions. How is that not a lie, what he said there during the campaign? There are certain things that are objective facts. If he had probably stuck around at Marquette University and gotten a good Jesuit education, they would have explained to him that a lie of omission is every bit as morally unacceptable as a lie of commission.
Anybody want to take that one?
So, I mean, what we do in our business is what Mike was just saying. Is we say, this is what Governor Walker said in September or October of 2010, just before he was elected to the Oshkosh Northwestern, that he would negotiate to get some of these changes. And then in March of 2011, introduced Act 10, which just changed the state law so there was no more negotiating effectively.
February.
Okay, February. Anyway, you get what I'm saying. So, I mean, and then it's up to people like, you call that a lie. Other people are going to have a different opinion about how, what they make of that statement. And they're welcome to make those opinions. I've done my job. I've told you what he said here and there.
Ma'am, did you have?
Well, I have 3 requests of the media. First, I disagree with not being able to get over where our governor is. So I'd like to see a daily graph or a cartoon. And you can call the governor's office every day, and you can get the same answer that you get right now. And then you can ask the broad public, has anybody seen Scott today? And you can put it out nationally. Where is he today?
Where in the world is Scott?
Second thing is that when you talked about the reporters having difficulty pinning him down into question number 2, and Mike inferred on that, is football players do huddles before they go out for the next play. Okay, reporters get together in a huddle and decide what is going to be your follow-up question. What is going to be the key one to pin him down for a more accurate answer? And the third one is reference to Mike's statement that he's playing to a national scene. Well, there's also a Wisconsin scene. So I would very much, every time he makes a statement to the national scene, how does that play out on the Wisconsin scene? In other words, you talked about how you covered education. He talks in grand terms about how wonderful education is in this country. What is the reality in Wisconsin right now?
What do you mean by that last statement or that last question? What is the reality? What's the question?
He might play out, and I've not listened recently, but he might say how wonderful education is across the country, and that he supports it widely. And yet, how many people know in Arkansas what he's actually done to education in this state?
This kind of dovetails with what Patrick was just talking about, because he does actually do this on the national stump, where he talks about how he really talks up these Act 10 reforms that obviously a lot of people in this room really can't stand, and then he'll talk about, and we're still number 2 ACT scores in the country, which was the case long before he was governor and hasn't changed, and he's taking credit, it seems like, for that, but at the same time he's also pointing out that it hasn't dropped, and yet the effects of Act 10 could be a decade in the making. So there's just it's a statement that is true. He's getting credit. He's trying to take credit for it in a way that again that's where we've been all along. And he does the same thing with graduation rates. And he's putting it in juxtaposition with this Act 10 thing, which we don't know what's going to happen 5 years from now. If teachers are going to be fleeing the profession and they're not going to be there's all kinds of long-term impacts that could have. But in the moment, he's not, he's, the statistics in the state for our education system aren't showing some kind of complete collapse. But would you really expect it to happen overnight? I don't think you would. So it's just, that's politics.
So I'd say a couple things. The idea of, how is something that he's saying to a national audience or to a national reporter, how is that playing locally? I think that's what our job is. I think that's why we're assigned, all of us, to cover him in these other places that he's going, because we all sort of do it with full awareness that it's very likely that he's saying things that are tailored to the people he's talking to in North Carolina, or the people he's talking to in Georgia today, or Florida tomorrow. And we're sort of trying to keep track. When he goes to CPAC and he makes a comment, if I can take on the protesters, I can take on ISIS. That plays. What's interesting is that in Wisconsin, obviously, that ended up being a statement that offended a great deal of people. Nationally, I think some people took that as more of an indication of his foreign policy credentials and experience, and you know what I mean? So,
Lack thereof.
or lack thereof, that it was like he wasn't taking it seriously or something to that effect. So I mean, you see how it can play differently, but like, you know, our story the next day is, you know, talking to teachers who are up there with their kids, and you know, like, and people who were here, and how did they view that comment, you know, while the national media is talking to foreign policy experts about, like, does he really get it, and that kind of thing. So I think that that's what a lot of our jobs are, is to make sure that people at home, I mean, you know, I don't know about you guys, but like you get some criticism when we're covering the governor so often while he's in other places, like, why are you talking about this guy so much? Like, there are people who have written us saying that. But at the same time, it's like, well, you have a person who's the governor of the state who may go say things in other places. Like, do you want to know what he's saying at CPAC? Like, would you rather have us cover that and know that, or have never known that at all because we didn't go or we didn't pay attention to it? So I think that's kind of our job. As far as the idea of like kind of huddling before we do some of these availabilities of the governor, I mean, I think the competitive nature of journalism is going to make it so that as likely as, you know, and as great as that sounds, he has a story that, you know, like we think about that day in lacrosse, he has a story that he's running on the front page of the Sunday paper the next day, you know, that he's got to get a quote from. Even if we huddled beforehand, he's done how many weeks of research on that story, and I'm like, what's that? So if we huddled and he overrules me and suddenly he asks a whole bunch of questions about that, then, you know, not that that's not a worthy story, but he's got a whole bunch of documents I don't have at that point. I mean, you know, yeah. I mean, that would be, you know, the idea of doing that would be then you might hear about one issue, and as Patrick was saying, sometimes, you know, we can ask about 20-week abortion bans today and state road money, which is holding up the budget, and all of these things. I mean, you kind of want to know about a lot of this stuff. It's just a matter of, like, we don't know on any given day, are we going to get 14 minutes, or are we going to get 4? And we can do the best that we can with the time that we have.
Yeah, I just want to amplify just a little bit on what Jessica was saying. I think, you know, with this huddle comment, I think you know, it's really interesting, and like, it's so appealing, right, from a news consumer perspective, to say, wouldn't it be great if reporters did this, and they would just get really in depth into a story. But when they huddle, they are not on the same team in the way that the Badgers are when they huddle, right? To watch Jessica's station, she needs to present something that you can't get somewhere else. And to read Patrick's paper or to read Matthew's paper, they need to be doing stories that they're breaking because of their expertise and their doggedness and their hard work and their investigations. And so to share that information may serve democracy, but it doesn't serve their paper staying open or their television station staying on the air. And that's just a reality of capitalism in a democracy.
So, I mean, there's a downside and there's an upside to that. If, you know, the major news of the day, all three of our organizations are going to have a story on that, and you as the news consumer can come and you can read Matt, what he writes about it and what I write about it and what Jessica puts on the air, and you get a fuller picture. Maybe I left out some quotes that he included. Maybe he got to somebody that I didn't. And you're a better informed citizen. At the same time, you're also better served on a slow news day when there's no clear major story that we all three produce something differently. And that now you know about 3 different things instead of just one thing. And, you know, we do sometimes huddle. I mean, there have been occasions where we're going to get the governor. We know it's probably going to be short. There are 3 burning issues. We kind of say, like, well, we got to hit these 2. We're not going to get to all 3. Let's prioritize this one first. It doesn't happen often, but it does happen sometimes. There's one other point I was going to make, and I forgot what it was.
So we build this forum from 7 to 8:30. It's now 8:30. But I know that our panel will have to run the gauntlet here to get out of here. So if they're willing to stick around for a little while and you're willing to stick around, let's keep going for a while.
Good.
Kate.
I was wondering whether you feel like you have an understanding of Walker's inner circle, and who are his advisors, what kind of advice is he getting, and how that's evolved as he's become more interested in the presidential campaign.
Are you asking about in Wisconsin or on a national level through our American Revival?
I would say both, just the people who are closest to him.
Okay. The question is, do the panelists have an understanding of Walker's inner circle and advisors and who he's listening to and getting advice from, and has that evolved from the time he was elected governor to now? Right.
Yeah, I think we have some sense of that, and I think Walker is kind of a guy who keeps his own counsel. He has a very small circle, from what I can tell. We did have the benefit from knowing in his first governor's run, Mark was talking earlier about when John Doe documents come out, like 10,000 at a time. They're like every email ever sent at the end of his career as county executive, and that his top staff and his second-tier staff sent, has been made for public consumption, and we have had the misfortune of going through it because some of it is very interesting, but 98% of it is like really dull stuff about the 2006 Milwaukee County budget, that you're looking at nearly 10 years after it happened. But you get a sense of, these were both political and governmental emails, and you get a sense of who these people were, how they were doing things. The clear takeaway from from that first race was just how involved the political team, the campaign team, was in making government decisions in how the county was run. His team has changed over time, and I think one thing that's been very interesting to see on the emerging presidential campaign is that Walker has always been the key decision maker in his own campaigns. He's really the guy who's been calling the shots. He's got advisors, but it's very clear that he's very involved in a way that's I haven't seen as much from other politicians, though we haven't been able to look at it as closely with other politicians. When you're running a presidential campaign, you can't do that. So it appears to me that he's starting to have to rely more on the advice of others and having to widen the pool. And I don't think we have as good a sense now. I mean, we know the names of his key advisors. Rick Wiley is his campaign manager. We know who some of these people are, but I think it's still kind of developing as to what that's going to look like.
So funny story from the campaign trail. I was actually, Marley and I were in South Carolina, in Charleston, and it was like the one time I've really gotten to have like a heart-to-heart almost with Rick Wiley. Like, these people are not accessible to the media. First of all, there's hundreds of reporters across the country that are trying to get access not only to Walker but to his top aides. We end up going a lot through his communication staff for this campaign in waiting, and they're very good. I mean, they definitely respond to us when we ask questions, but and very much like his state setup, where you're basically sort of corralled into talking to not the inner circle, but to the communications person. And so you're always looking when you're at these events for opportunities to try to just kind of rub shoulders or elbows with the like Rick or other people, and his top people in Iowa or New Hampshire, and so it was interesting to me that the one time I felt like I was having an actual conversation with Rick Wiley, where we were kind of like, yucking it up and trying to get to know this person. Thanks, Mark. We were sitting outside a hotel where he was talking to an NRA event in Charleston, closed press. We weren't allowed to go in and schmooze with the people who were holding the event. And so at one point, the communications director, Kirsten Sikowski, and Rick Wiley come out, and they just start kind of chatting with us. It was kind of like, hey, finally get to talk to you guys. It's great. And then sort of when we turn around, like Walker has like snuck out to like the back and gone into like his car, and we were waiting outside this event for, I don't know, like an hour or something to try to talk to him. And he totally just ducked out the back alley. And I really think they were running interference. Like I really feel
we're never going to get it.
I really feel like the only reason that they were talking to us was just to kind of distract us while he snuck out the back. But so otherwise, no, I don't get to talk to those people. So.
I mean, a lot of his campaign staff, campaign staff, are from Wisconsin, right? I mean, they worked here. Can you guys talk about?
It depends what you're thinking about. I mean, he's got his people from Wisconsin have started his Unintimidated PAC, so like Keith Jilks and
Kirsten's Wisconsin
Steph Thompson,
and so
Rick's from
Rick's
well, and so his campaign manager was a former executive director of the Republican Party of Wisconsin, but he was also with the National Republican Party for a while. But no, he's collecting like this national I mean, he's getting top people, and they'll announce that like former Senator Jim Talent from Missouri is like his foreign policy advisor. So, I mean, he's getting there are all these mini primaries for like the this top talent nationally, and Walker's actually, I think, done pretty well. At least that's the way it seems. I mean, I don't know every single person that every candidate's getting, but
another question. Got time for a couple more. Yes, sir.
Yeah, we talked a lot about Walker's use of language, and he's so good at it. But it just seems to me that in his first term as governor, he was much more disciplined. He really hammered public employees, and he used the fact that in many cases they enjoy fringe benefits that many in the private sector can only dream of, and that delivered 3 electoral victories in a 4-year period. Now in his second term, he's attacking the UW budget, he's attacking state park users, he's attacking bicycle riders, he's attacking public TV watchers. What happens to Scott Walker when he runs out of people to demonize?
The question is, what happens to Governor Walker when he runs out of people to demonize? The questioner pointed out that in his first term, he set himself up against public employee unions, but now with his latest budget, there are a number of issues, whether it's cuts to UW, cuts to bicycle paths, et cetera, et cetera. Anybody who want to take a stab at the thought about the governor's political future?
I mean, I guess I would say that I don't know that during his first term that he didn't also have a shotgun approach then as well. It's just that the biggest piece of shrapnel was I mean, speaking from the perspective of someone who were opposed to Act 10, right? Like the biggest opponents of the governor, the biggest thing coming at them was Act 10. And so there was less attention from both the public and the media to some extent on other things that the Republicans were doing. But I mean, keep in mind that if you take away Act 10, Governor Walker achieved many things that the Republicans of Wisconsin had been hoping for a decade. Voter ID. Took them a long time to get that through. Concealed carry. The Castle Doctrine, which is sort of another gun law issue. Restrictions on Planned Parenthood spending. Tax cuts. So, I mean, you see, there's all these things. And so now you don't have Act 10 there. You've just got all this other stuff. And I would say the UW cut is probably the one that's taken center stage. But you've got many of the same things in a similar approach that you saw in the first term. It's just that there's not the one clear main event.
And I would say, too, you also, now you have lawmakers pushing back a little bit more on some of these things, too. I mean, in the first term, all those things that Patrick mentioned were all things that the Republican-controlled legislature were very intent on moving through quite quickly. And now the things that we're looking at this time around are things that are not as palatable to some of them, and you see them pushing back on education, you see them somewhat pushing back on the UW system. I think you're right, to a certain extent, Act 10 was kind of the big shiny object that everyone paid attention to and felt so deeply for so long that it's not as recognizable that they were working on a lot of other things and did a lot of other things in that 4-year term, and this time there isn't one big shiny thing to look at as much, or there's not one thing that people are rallying as much around. There's a lot of people that are rallying around long-term care, family care, and IRIS, and there's a section of people rallying around the university, and it's not 100,000 people showing up at the Capitol on one thing. It's a whole bunch of people worried about other individual things.
You're Warren? Are you Warren?
Yeah, Warren Gordon.
One of our prolific letter writers to the Wisconsin State Journal, Mr. Warren Gordon. I didn't introduce myself as a State Journal assistant city editor, but that's what I do in my day job. I do my volunteer work with SPJ. We profiled a number of our letter writers, and Warren was one of them, so God love you.
You're very generous.
Another question.
I just wondered if the media felt that they might have been being taken advantage of early on in Walker's reign, because he was on television constantly, to the point that I actually started writing it down on my calendar every evening that I saw him interviewed, sometimes 2 or 3 times for different things. And I felt that he was able to get his point across without much things coming back. And what you said about Governor Doyle not being so accessible, I felt that the media was just going, oh, he's here, I can talk to him, I can talk to him.
Question, yeah, we got that
Here.
on the microphone.
Well, I can tell you this sort of a backstory. So whenever you see, well, oftentimes, it's not as much anymore, but oftentimes when you see the governor appearing on a national program, MSNBC, Fox News, any of the national programs, a lot of times those are uplinked from here. And so the governor very often during Act 10 would come to our studios, because we do a lot of the uplinks in town, and would come to our studios and do interviews on that. He would oftentimes hold a press conference earlier in the day, and then he would be there for a morning uplink, and then you'd be there for an afternoon uplink. So, and the thing about Act 10 is, and what happened in 2011, and we sort of all lived it, but there were, like, living through Act 10 as a Capitol Press Corps member was like sort of like walking around in a minefield. Like every day there was some huge thing that it was like, oh my gosh, this is happening. Oh my gosh, this is happening. And so, you know, in each sort of news, little mini news cycle, a morning news cycle, a new news cycle, a late news cycle, whatever, there were developments that were happening. And if he was in our studio, it would be like, well, this just happened. If he's here, let's go ask him about it, you know? And I'll be honest, I'm of the opinion that, like, if you get a chance to ask a politician about something, whether they're going to give you their answer or not, you can follow up, especially if you get them in a one-on-one situation like that, you're much more likely to get follow-up questions than you are in the gaggles or in a press conference. So I think we were of the opinion that if we can get him and we can ask him about what's happened, and we can ask him about the Democrats are saying that they won't take phone calls and they won't negotiate about this, or we can ask him about there was a fake prank phone call like that, you know, how did that happen, you know, what have you. If we have access to him and we can ask him about it, I think we can, or we want to, and I think, at least this is how I've always thought of it, but I think most of our viewers would want us to, like, if the governor's walking in the door of our building and so a major development has just happened in a major story, why would we not ask him and try to get him on our air that night? So I don't think, I mean, I very honestly can say it was not a concerted effort, like, let's get Scott Walker on the air as much as humanly possible in this amount of time, you know, like it may have looked that way given how often he was on during that period of time, but I think it was that this was the main figure in a story that was playing out rapidly every day, and that's who you have to ask about it. And whether or not you feel like we appropriately followed up on the right number of questions is a completely different situation that is up to you to decide, obviously.
I never felt that the media were doing anything wrong. I wondered if Scott Walker wasn't trying to take advantage of the fact the media was more than welcome to.
Right. She was saying that she's wondering if they were trying to take it, and to a certain extent, I think that might have been partially the case. If you think about, as Patrick said, you have literally the political world exploding outside of your office doors every day. To invite reporters in and answer questions, I think we all thought at the time was kind of unprecedented, especially the administration we'd seen before and their sort of general policy on how they handled the media. So I think there was an acknowledgement of, hey, if they want to talk to us, we'll give us their, you know, like, we'll give them talking points until we're blue in the face, you know, like they might have kind of known that, but, you know, that's.
I wanted to see if Professor Wagner could address that topic of you know, different politicians being more accessible, and whether that's good for them or not.
Well, I think part of it has to do with just the politician's level of comfort in that situation, right? I mean, you know, the joke amongst people who cover the Senate as the most dangerous place, in Washington, D.C. is between Chuck Schumer and a camera, because he wants that coverage, right? And you can see who's on the Sunday morning talk shows. Chuck Schumer, John McCain, they're on all the time because they want to be on all the time. And so some politicians really like that attention. They think that they can control the conversation, or at least deflect things that they don't want to talk about. At least they go in thinking that they can do that. They're not always successful at doing that when reporters ask good questions. But some politicians are just more comfortable doing that, I think, than others. And so that's part of it. Another thing that's happening here, though, is just the nature of how our democracy is set up, right? We have a chief executive in the state, and that's Governor Walker. And, well, who's the person who's Governor Walker's opponent that we should also talk to? That's not always obvious. And so Governor Walker's going to get more attention. He's the governor. He's the chief executive of the state. President Obama gets more coverage than John Boehner does and Mitch McConnell does, because it's just easier to do that. And that person signs their name on the bills at the end of the day and makes them law, and they present a budget that then the legislature deals with. And so our reporting is president-centric at the national level, it's governor-centric at the state level, it's mayor-centric at the city level typically, because in the way most cities and states and set up their decision making, the chief executives do more, and therefore they're worth talking to, and it's certainly worth sharing with your audience what we learned when we talked to somebody.
So now we are nearing 9 o'clock. I think we ought to take one question.
Someone over there had a question.
I do want to say thanks. Your questions were terrific. They're hard. And we appreciate you being here. One more.
Okay. I think that really when push comes to shove, it's what people do that counts, not what they say. And I'm hearing a lot about chasing people for quotes. I think everybody in the room here has a concern about the honesty, whether we call it, being political, manipulating, lying, whatever it is. They're real questions. We all know that people say what's to their advantage, what they're trying to get across. But what they do is what counts. And is there any way that you can see the news providing more information about what people do? Because that's what we need to make our judgments on. If we base it on what they say, we're going to be misled.
Well, I agree with you entirely. It's not, what's important is not what politicians say is in a piece of legislation. What's important is what is in that legislation. And what they say is, it's good to know that, and it's good to hear how they're framing it and why they're explaining why they do certain things. But my starting point always is, okay, here's a bill. It's been introduced. It does X, Y, and Z. Then you go to the sponsors of that bill, you find out, and they tell you why they're doing what they're doing, and you can provide the needed context for that. So you don't have to convert me. I agree that the starting point is what people do and the facts.
Yeah, I think that's right, and I think you have to look at when you talk about what they do. A lot of the lawmaking that goes on in our state capitol too, the real discussions about things happen behind closed doors. And then we see a final bill that comes out. We see the final thing that people talk about. So I think the meat of what are people voting on? What did they pass? What did they put in this bill? What did it say? I think we're I think many of us are doing our best to try to cover some of those things. I think that like I said, the shouting sometimes takes precedence, because in my business, sometimes that's what producers think make good TV.
Yeah.
But it's and you think about when you take something like prevailing wage, like an issue that's really nuanced and complicated. How do you make that interesting to a viewer for a minute and a half and really explain to them why it matters to them? And so I think we're all we tend to agree with you. I think we're all trying to figure out how to make that interesting, that you as a viewer or a reader are going to stick around and watch that story because it taught you something that day. It taught you something about what they were doing, and not just what they were saying about what they were doing. But I think that's what we're trying to do.
So as an addendum to what I said earlier about how people think, in other states think that the Governor Walker is honest, the way they follow that up is they say, he's honest because he says what he's going to do and he does it. And I think obviously people here would have objections he didn't really going to do Act 10. And the people in the other states don't realize that. They think, oh yeah, he said he was going to get rid of unions and he did it. But you're absolutely right. They care more about the fact that he did it. Like they like that. That's their thing. Like they are just, I go to South Carolina, has the lowest union participation rates in the country, and people there are like, they get really excited about the fact that he passed right to work. That's like, woohoo! They're like shooting guns in the air over that. And it's like, and it's so the fact that he has done these things is I would argue, why, when he goes up there, he lists all these things he's in that Patrick mentioned earlier. That is why people are so drawn to him. Because when Ted Cruz gets up there, he says, he basically gets up there and says, like, I will abolish the IRS. And it's just like, really? You're really going to do that? And I think people, he's not climbing in the polls the same way Walker is, because I think people hear him talk, and, Walker has sort of drawn that sort of, he's making that actually, he talks about there's being like two camps among the Republican contenders, one of which is people who have like, won a lot of elections but haven't done a whole lot, and other people who have done a lot in their states but haven't really, and he's like, I'm the one who's like actually done stuff and won tough hard fights, and I still think he's going to be up there until the end, unless that John Doe thing comes back to bite him, but we'll see.
Yeah, I think what everybody's saying here is well taken, right? I mean, what people want to know and what reporters want to report to their audiences are, what are these people doing? And they also want to report, I think, as people have brought up, how does what our leaders, our politicians are doing line up with what they say they're doing? And I think we get a lot of that in news coverage. But the other thing that I think we want to know about that's a lot harder to report about is, after they did it, how well did it work? And that's really difficult to know. Right, so Governor Walker makes a promise about delivering 250,000 jobs, and we have a number that's been reported that is less than that of how many jobs have been produced. And so it would be easy to say, okay, the governor failed because he fell short of his goal. Well, given the economic conditions, how many jobs should we have projected? Compared to other states, did he do better or worse? And those stories are more difficult to tell, and they are sometimes told, but they take time and resources, which are things that reporters have less and less of.
It's in the Financial Times today, along with a look at WEDC by Megan Murphy, if you want to take a look at it.
Yeah, no, I thought of that because I saw the story. And so these things are really difficult to do and take a long period of time. And increasingly, especially in local newsrooms, reporters are being asked to do more with fewer reporters and less time. So go do your story, also put something up for the web, also tweet it out, and we're also letting go of the other political reporter. Now do a better job than what you were doing before. And part of the economics of the news business make it hard to do the kinds of stories that are the most vital, for the conduct of our democracy. One of the worst and most interesting, I think, kind of research findings about political communication is that we tend to learn the most about the details of what's in a bill after it gets passed. Yeah. And so and part of that is just a function of things often change up into the last minute, but part of it's also a lot of the reporting is about people's motives, the audience they're trying to appeal to, the voters that the money people, the interest groups that are a part of it, and we learn the details. We learn them, but we often learn them after the fact. And then it's even more difficult to then learn, well, how well did that work? And it's also hard because, if reporters are really, really good at their job in Janesville, 4 years later they've moved on to somewhere else, and to a bigger market, doing more things. And then the institutional memory of what they knew when they covered that issue might be lost. And so part of it's just the economics of the news business make it really, really difficult to do outstanding journalism.
Journalism is hard today. It's different than it was 10 years ago or 20 years ago or 40 years ago. But it may be no surprise to our audience here that I'm incredibly proud not only of these three reporters, but the press corps in Wisconsin. I think we actually have done a very good job in writing about what politicians say and what they do. We're the first draft of history. We don't always see sort of the long term in the short term, but I think when you put when you are able to look at the depth and breadth of coverage here in Wisconsin. I'm very proud of what these folks are doing. I really thank you all for coming here tonight. Thank you.